All right, back with part two. So we were talking about the fact that Hitler and Stalin are fighting, and the Stalin is unprepared. But Stalin does know that Russia's big, so he used scorched earth tactics, which we talked about again, but I want to write down. And that's when you fall back before the enemy, you burn anything that could potentially be useful to the enemy in any way. So you are going to make sure there's no food, that there's no towns. You're going to even withdraw any people who might be useful. The Soviets also took this to another extreme. What they would do is they would take trains and bring up troops who were barely trained, often not very well armed, and they would just throw them into battle against the Germans just to try to delay them. And then they'd take those trains and they'd try to actually take factories apart, put them on the trains, and move them back to safer areas. This worked very well. By the time they got towards the end, they were able to take a tank factory from Western Russia, move it hundreds of miles to the middle of Russia, put it all back together, and have it running within 1 month. So the Soviets prized industry over people because Stalin knew that he could always sacrifice human life. What he really needed to do is to be able to build tanks and things. All right, so this German Operation Barbarossa is going well. It's pushing into huge parts of Russia. They're taking lots of people, but they're starting to run into winter. And that's going to happen most notably at a place called Stalingrad. Stalingrad is, of course, named after Stalin, so it's a super important spot. So in 1942, there's this massive battle between Russia and Germany. I'm going to take a second and we're going to look at about 3 minute video about that.
Hitler's overconfidence as he ordered the Sixth Army, led by Friedrich Paulus, into the city of Stalingrad. Located on the Volga River, it was a strategic, industrial, and communication center. But also taking the city that bore Stalin's name was a matter of pride for Hitler. Unknown to him, however, the Soviet forces would mount their greatest stand here. Every Soviet citizen in the city were put to work on the defenses. Stalin would even issue a not one step back directive, ordering the execution of anyone showing signs of defeatism. On the 23rd of August 1942, the Germans reached the outskirts of the city and began an aerial bombardment, first targeting the Volga to break the supply lines of troops coming from the east, then targeted the rest of the city, turning much of it into rubble. German forces entered the city with their Axis allies and engaged in house-to-house urban warfare. The two sides were so close that they could throw back a grenade before it exploded. Every building and street was fought for. After 3 months of fighting, the Germans were able to capture 90% of the city. Leading the Soviet defenses was Georgy Zhukov, and he planned a counter-offensive against the Germans. His plan was to attack the weaker Axis troops protecting the German flank in a pincer movement to cut off the Sixth Army from their supply line. The outnumbered Axis allies were easily defeated, and Zhukov was able to surround the Sixth Army. As winter set in, the enclosed army was plagued by starvation, frostbite, disease, and even suicide. Friedrich Paulus and his officers saw the hopelessness of the situation and requested for permission to surrender, but Hitler wouldn't have any of it. His pride was on the line, and he would have the Sixth Army perish while fighting to the last man rather than surrender. He would even promise reinforcements to relieve the city, but they would never make it to Stalingrad. A few German planes managed to land within the city amidst the scenes of panic and took whoever they could. On one of the last planes to leave the city, a defeated Paulus would send his wedding ring back to his wife, expecting the worst. By January 1943, the Soviet troops surrounded the Sixth Army within 2 pockets of the city. Even then, Hitler forbid Paulus to surrender and preferred he rather commit suicide rather than be captured. But on the morning of the 31st, Paulus was caught. The rest of his army would surrender shortly after. 90,000 Axis troops were taken prisoner. Half of them would die on their way to the Soviet prison camps, and most of the other half would perish during captivity. Only about 6,000 would return home nearly a decade later. Of about the 1,040,000 Axis invaders, about 850,000 have been killed, missing, or wounded. And of the 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and civilians involved in the conflict, about 1.1 million of them would also be killed, missing, or wounded.
All right, so you've got this massive battle, which is really just kind of a grudge match between Stalin and Hitler, and millions die, but it's a turning point in the war. From this point forward, Russia's going to start pushing Germany back because Germany's gambit to take all of Russia had ended. All right, so I want you to take a second, do a quick write. Why was Stalingrad so important to the Germans and the Russians? What do you think would have happened if the Germans had won? All right, and we're back. Let's keep moving. All right. So at the same time that this is happening, the United States is not in the war yet. They have what's called isolationism. That's a word I want to write down. We see that throughout U.S. history. It's the idea that the United States should not get involved in foreign affairs, that it should take care of America first. Interestingly, Donald Trump, when he ran in 2016, ran under the concept of America first. The history teacher and me laughed at it since America first was how people who wanted to keep the United States out of World War II who kind of choose to be wrong. We can see right here that there is a cartoon here. This is Uncle Sam. He's saying over here that they can keep fighting their wars, but he's not going to be involved. The United States will not be their blood donor. So many people in America, as this war went on in 1930, 1940, 1941, decided that they did not want to be a part of the war. You'll see this in a few different other political cartoons by Dr. Seuss. So this one has the America First people talking about it, Adolf Hitler, saying the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but these were foreign children and it didn't really matter. Basically saying if they're not Americans, it doesn't matter. So obviously Dr. Seuss feels that these people are perhaps a little inhumane, thinking that foreign children aren't as important. Over here, you've got another one where you've got Uncle Sam in a classic Dr. Seuss bird creature sitting in a tree. And around here, you see all these trees that have been chopped down by the Nazi little woodpecker. And it's France is down in Poland and Holland and Norway and Denmark. And England's under attack. And this American one seems to be saying, he'll probably be done after that one. So obviously, Dr. Seuss is saying that these people are not that bright. All right, but the United States doesn't totally not get involved. They understand that things aren't going well for Britain, that it's in their interest for fascism not to take over. So they have what's called Lend Lease. So it's this UN's plan to be the arsenal of democracy. An arsenal is like a weapons storage facility. So what they're doing is they're lending out weapons and supplies to the Allies without entering the war. So they send over $50.1 billion worth of goods. That's about $680 billion today, and it's kind of sent as a loan that the Allies don't really have to repay. What the United States gets in return, especially from Britain and from Russia, is the ability to put military bases in their colonial possessions. So when you think about the U.S. having military bases all over the world today, a lot of that comes back to Lend Lease because that's how the United States took repayment for some of these loans was they got military bases in their territory, which of course helps the United States later on in life. So they're sending over all kinds of things: ships, guns, tanks, even huge factories. A lot of this going to Russia. All right, so we got to switch gears here. We got to go back to Japan. So when we were talking about Japan, we talked about they didn't have a lot of natural resources. You remember it was oil and rubber were the big ones. So they started invading Asia, invading into French Indochina, which is where Vietnam is today, but it was owned by France then. And the United States gets worried about this. They don't like Japan expanding. They don't like Japan as a Pacific power. So what they do is they say, we're not going to sell you oil anymore. The United States supplied like 80% of the oil Japan was using. They also didn't like that Japan was friends with Germany because they were starting to realize that Germany was someone they might have to fight. So they decide no more oil. And Japan gets upset about this. They know they can't keep fighting without oil, so they're going to have to go to war with the United States. So what they do is they launch an attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is the big U.S. naval base. It's over here. Before this, war was often fought using battleships. So big ships would sail up and shoot guns at each other. They usually could see each other, even though there might be some smoke that they would hide in. But Japan realizes there's a new kind of war, which are these aircraft carriers. So they sail their aircraft carriers secretly over here, and on Sunday, December 7th, they launch an attack on the Hawaiian Islands. And they sink 7 different battleships. They escape with losing maybe 15, 20 different um, planes. They also attack Wake Island, which is a U.S. base over here. It seems like a huge success. But it is an issue because now the United States is in the war. They declare war on Japan on December 8th, And Italy and Germany and the United States also end up in war because everybody has signed these treaties that they're going to protect each other. Again, a little bit like World War One. So now the United States is fully in the war. One of the things that's important to note is the United States had aircraft carriers that were not at Pearl Harbor when this happened, and that'll prove decisive. All right, so after the United States is in the war, they have what's called the Tehran Conference. Tehran is in Iran, which is over in here. This is from a great board game called Axis and Allies that you should try, but it shows kind of when the United States enters the war, where things are. There's some allied Chinese troops, but Japan is kind of controlling the coast. Uh, the Germans and Italians are in North Africa. They're pushing into Russia. And so Stalin, Churchill, and FDR decide they're going to meet. They talk about what to do, and they say the United States and Britain are going to open up a second front in Europe to try to keep Germany from being able to put all of their forces towards Russia, which would help Russia push back towards Germany. The United States and Britain also agree to fight in the Pacific, but to put most of their effort towards Europe because they're worried about Stalin getting knocked out. All right, so the United States doesn't want to go for France here because Germany has tons of troops there and is trying to defend it. So they decide that they're going to try a different way. So they attack into Africa and they spend several months knocking through Africa. They land troops all along. They have some fighting in the mountains and eventually kick the Germans out of Africa. Then they invade Sicily, which is this island right at the boot of Italy, and then they attack up the Italian peninsula. So this takes place in 1942, 1943. Things are starting to turn against Germany. They're starting to, Italy gets kind of knocked out of the war, and the Germans have to take over the defense of Italy. However, that move up Italy is kind of ill-fated because, as you'll notice as they come up here, there's some mountains, but there are huge mountains up here. So it's going to be very difficult for the United States to invade up into Germany through these mountains. It doesn't take many troops to defend this, so they're going to have to find another way. At the same time, you've got Russia pushing back through Poland, but there's so much territory that it's taking them a long time, obviously, to move back. The Germans have most of their troops over here fighting Russia, but they know that they've got to worry about the United States and Britain potentially invading France. So if you look at France, if you're invading from England, there's a lot of places you can try to go. They've got this whole coastline here. They can attack along the southern coastline. So Hitler knows he's got to do something to defend it. So what he does is for 2 years he knows this is coming. He makes what's called the Atlantic Wall. So the Atlantic Wall are these defenses he puts up all along. So he identifies all the places that would be good places to land, where you've got a good beach, where the tides are right, where you might have some harbors nearby so you can start landing supplies that troops need to fight in war. And he starts making defenses. So they build these massive concrete uh, gun emplacements that can overlook the sea and shoot at ships as they come up. They put all kinds of things on the shore to make it harder to land ships. So these are little metal kind of crosses that have mines attached to them, stakes that will keep people from getting in. Anywhere that there's kind of like a path off the beach, they're going to put minefields in, these big, huge concrete pillars, these big guns that are going to be hard to knock out. They're trying to make it so that they will be able to throw back that invasion because they know that will throw back the Allies several years, and they also know that Stalin and the West are not exactly best friends. One's kind of a democracy and one's a dictatorship. So they're hoping that they can kind of make those two turn on each other. All right, so the Allies know they're going to invade. They know the Germans know it. So what they get involved with is called Operation Fortitude. So Operation Fortitude was this plan to mislead the Nazis about the invasion target. So they start building up places where there's fake armies. So they know that the Germans are going to fly planes over and see it. So they build these kind of wooden tanks. This looks like a plane, but it's a wooden glider. This is the insignia of Operation Fortitude. You can kind of tell what they're about. They're kind of a ghost army. Um, this tank is one of my favorite pictures. This is made entirely out of rubber, so 4 men can pick it up. But if you were to see it from the sky and you saw a whole field of these, you would think that there's a huge army there. At the same time, the Allies also know that they're going to be able to rely on people within Germany. People are not super excited about the Axis being there. They're taking away people, they're taking away freedoms. So we have two different kinds of people who kind of pop up. It's years and years that this is happening. So there's the resistance, who are people who are fighting and occupying power. They're gathering intelligence, they're blowing up trains, they're trying to spy on information. If Allied air people who are flying over get shot down, they're going to help them try to escape back to Allied lines so they can keep fighting. At the same time, there are other people who work with the occupiers. What you're seeing here is after the war, often what they would do to punish these people, especially women, is shave their heads so that they would be publicly shamed going around. So the Allies know that not only are they going to have a lot of German defenses, but they are going to have something positive, which is they're going to have people in France who are very upset about the Nazis being there and are going to work to help them from behind enemy lines. So this brings to my favorite battle of World War II, which is D-Day. This is the day that they landed and opened a second front. To kind of give you an idea of how complicated it was, they spent 6 to 8 months planning this down to a meticulous detail. The first thing they did is they dropped in paratroopers behind to try to hold things because they were worried that as they landed, the Germans would move up tanks and troops and knock them back into the sea when they were vulnerable on the beaches. They had over almost 7,000 aircraft vessels that launched a barrage and fired guns all along this coast of France, which is in Normandy, right over here. And then they also had planes dropping bombs, and then they sent in troops on 5 different beaches trying to push inland and hold something so that they could land more and more troops and eventually move into France. This is Dwight Eisenhower, who later became U.S. president. He was kind of the commander of it. He's an American. He said, "They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate." And this is kind of true. One of the problems that we had with World War One as we went through it is we thought, "What is the point of this war? They are fighting because kings and people sign treaties, and everybody thinks they're, super awesome, have a better military, so they're fighting for nothing." In this war, even though there are problems in the United States, there are racial issues that are going on, there is something that they're fighting against that is evil. They are fighting against people who don't believe in democracy, who don't believe in people having the right to do what they want to do, who are oppressing Jews, gay people, communists, anybody who they don't like. So this really is a noble thing. So you'll see all these guys. Many of them have kind of ink all over their face, so that at night when they jump in, they won't be able to be seen. Of the people in this picture, 60 to 70% are going to die that night, but they're going to jump out of these planes anyway into the dark to fight. You also see this picture here. They wrote on the side, "The channel stopped you, but not us." Talking to Hitler. Now it's our turn, saying you couldn't invade us, but we're going to be able to come back across and kick your butt. These are the guys right before they jumped off. They're carrying 50 to 60 pounds of stuff. They're carrying pieces of large weapons that 2 or 3 guys can then put together and have a bigger gun. They are carrying all kinds of supplies because they're going to be behind enemy lines. It's really jumping into combat when you're almost like unable to walk. So it's very impressive what they did. All right, so the plan doesn't go perfectly well, but their hopes was to make it to this orange line on the first day, and they only got to the red. But they are able to hold this beach hold. The lowest one is on this beach called Omaha, in which they kind of over 2,000 guys get killed on that day. But they have better luck on the British sides, and they've established this foothold in France. Here's another photo of the day after D-Day as they're landing. You can see all these ships pulling up, discharging their troops. Then they'll take back in other like wounded people or prisoners that need to come back, and it'll get towed back out to sea and sail back to Britain. You've got all these kind of balloons up here keeping an eye to make sure that the Germans aren't going to send planes, and you're sending troops inland. So this kind of shows you the industrial might that they're landing. And again, just to have a concept, almost 15,000 planes, 150,000 troops, 36 million pounds of bombs. They really came after it. So once they landed, they started moving in. They eventually landed in the south, and they're kind of pushing back and liberating France over 1944. At the same time, Russia is coming and pushing into Germany, pushing on all fronts. So Germany is collapsing in, but Hitler refuses to give up. All right, we're going to switch back to the Pacific. So in the Pacific, you had Pearl Harbor, obviously, which really damaged the United States, but got it in the war. This is an aircraft carrier. We talked about them. This is basically a runway on a boat. So you would take off, go off and do the bombing thing, and then land back on the ship. So these became the dominant weapons. You can fly a plane 500 miles. So you don't even have to be close to another ship in order to sink it. But of course, you have to be able to find them. So that's the big key part of these huge aircraft battles is you would have these ships. You're trying to find where the other fleet is and then sink it with bombs. All right. So after Pearl Harbor, Japan has 10 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and the U.S. has 3. But we're going to explore this a little bit more. But throughout the rest of the war, the United States would build 124 carriers, while Japan only built 18. So if Japan's going to win, they've got to win right away. So the United States knows that Japan is winning the war so far, but they need to do something to kind of push Japan back and to give hope to the United States. So what they do is they take one of these aircraft carriers and they send it on a secret mission off of Japan, and they launch their planes at the flight at the range that the planes won't be able to make it back to the ship. What they'll do is they're going to hit Japan and then try to land with Chinese forces, so that they will be able to escape. So it's not a particularly useful raid. They don't really do much. They drop a few bombs on Tokyo, but it's horribly damaging to the Japanese. The Japanese are hugely offended that their city was attacked. They're upset that they've told their people that this will be a war of unending victories, and it's the first time that there is this huge issue. So this is where Japan is at this time, and they decide we're not far enough. If people can get close enough to bomb our homeland, we've got to push further, which is going to set up one of the most amazing battles of World War II, which is the Battle of Midway. Before that, the Americans have an advantage. All military forces in World War II have what are called codes, naval codes, army codes. They're constantly kind of switching. And what these do is these allow you to send a message to this fleet or this ship or that without the enemy knowing it. Because everybody can listen to the radio waves, but if they don't know the code, they can't do it. So American cryptographers, which are people who kind of solve puzzles and try to figure this out, rate the naval code. It's by this guy, Joe Rochefort and Agnes Mayer Driscoll, both of whom were very intelligent people who headed divisions of people who broke codes. So they realized the Japanese are going to come out and try to attack towards Pearl Harbor again. So the U.S. had this aircraft carrier called the USS Yorktown that had been damaged earlier. It had about a month of repair left, but they did it in 3 days. They were actually literally sailing out to the battle while ships sailed alongside with carpenters and people who were fixing holes in the side of the ship. So they knew they were going to need as much as they could get. So this Battle of the Midway happens kind of midway between Japan and the United States. Off of here is Pearl Harbor and Russia, and it's this huge aircraft battle, carrier battle. And the United States wins. They use this kind of idea of knowing where the Japanese are to launch their planes. They sink 4 Japanese carriers. The U.S. only loses one. So at that point, remember we had that kind of 10-3 advantage. Now it's down to like 6-2, and the United States has all kinds of carriers that they're building. So the war has kind of changed on Japan. From then on, they're fighting on the defensive. They've got all of this territory, but they're not going to be able to expand any further. And the smart ones, kind of among them, know that it's really only if they make the war last so long that the United States people quit that they'll be able to win. So that takes us to the U.S. policy. There's all these islands that Japan has fortified, so they take a strategy called island hopping. So what they're doing is they're kind of bypassing some islands and just attacking other ones. So you'll see, like for example, if they get to Tarawa here, they're going to invade it, which they do in November of 1943. If they're going to build bases on it, they're going to use that to bomb the other smaller islands around that to keep them from attacking, and then they're going to skip ahead to their next base. So they're basically building bases throughout as they work their way up to Japan. And they're doing it on two fronts. One, they're moving from the south here up towards the Philippines, and this one they're kind of moving across the way to get to the Philippines. And all right. So during this, Japan is kind of in trouble. We talked about how they have this Bushido, this samurai code. And so that starts showing itself in strange ways. So the Japanese Navy can't really defend these islands. So these garrisons on these islands are kind of stranded. So as they start running out of supplies, rather than be captured, because that would be dishonorable in Japan, you see these mass attacks in which they send all of their troops running at a defensive position at night, hoping they can overwhelm it and change the battle. So that's called a banzai charge. Kamikaze, you remember, was that sacred wind, that wind of the gods that sunk the Mongol fleets. Japan kind of repurposes that. What they do is they have planes, but they don't have well-trained pilots as the war goes along. So they start getting kind of brand new pilots, and they train them to just crash their plane into an American ship. You lose one plane and one guy, and you might take out an entire ship. So these kamikaze attacks are not particularly effective in turning the war, but they are terrifying to Americans and also kind of show this concept that Japan will fight to the end. I'm not going to go into any of the major, huge battles, but I do want to talk about one of them just to give you an example of what they kind of all were like, and that's called Iwo Jima. This is Iwo Jima today. You can see it's kind of a flat, rocky island dominated by this massive kind of volcanic mountain at the end. You will remember Iwo Jima from this photo, which there are many statues of. It's them putting the flag up over the island. But before that, they had to take it. It was very difficult. This is kind of that mountain here, and the Japanese had dug massive tunnels into it, and they had troops there and supplies there and places for troops to sleep, and generals were in there. So you'd have to enter into it, and then there'd be booby traps, and there'd be people fighting. So it's this massive, awful, month-long campaign to try to invade and take over this mountain. Because at night they would sneak out from secret places and launch attacks on U.S. troops. So you can't even just leave them alone because you don't know where they're going to come out. You can see kind of here after the war, they're showing places where troops might live. It doesn't look like a great place to live, but again, you're just trying to resist as long as possible. They would use flamethrowers to get them out, and a lot of times they would just scatter. So this is the Japanese soldier who lasted the longest. He waited till 1974. He spent 32 years defending the island. Eventually, they had to go and get his commanding officer to come back, and that commanding officer had to like go into the mountains and find him and say it's okay for you to surrender because that commanding officer had told him never surrender, and he took it as a moment of pride. He eventually went back to Japan, kind of a hero, and was reunited with his family after spending 32 years fighting this like solitary war on his own in a remote island. So that kind of takes us to the end of the general broad strokes of World War II. We'll get into more specifics, but basically, you've got this story of Germany and Japan being slowly invaded from both sides. In the Pacific, they're doing the island hopping and the naval battles after they've won those early ones that kind of turn the tide of the war. And over in Europe, you've got Stalingrad, which is this turning point, so the Russians start invading, and then the United States and United Kingdom are able to invade through Africa, Italy, France, and push the Germans back for an Allied victory. All right, I want you to take a quick look at this chart. This is the World War II deaths. So what you're going to see for each country is the military deaths and then the civilian deaths. So you can see that many or even most of the people who died in this war were not soldiers, they were civilians. For some countries, that's not as true. For example, the United States is almost entirely military. But you look at a place like China or the Soviet Union or even Germany, and there's large portions of people who are civilians. If you count these up, 4%, that's 62% of people who died were civilians during the war. You can also see the percentage of deaths, uh, the total deaths as a percentage of the population. So if you look at Poland, somewhere around 20% of all of its people in 1939 were dead by the end of the Soviet Union's over 10%. You go to the United States, it's a very small 1 to 2%. But some of these countries really, really get hit. Lithuania doesn't have a lot of military deaths, but look how over 10 to 15% of the population is dead at the end of the war. So World War II is this massively costly war. 60 million people died. But you really had, when we go back to those questions that we asked at the very beginning, which let me move back up to just look at those quick before we're done, and we do a little writing, is you have this clash between nationalism and socialism, and nationalism is defeated. This kind of idea of fascism is done, and socialism wins. So the rest of the 20th century is going to be kind of a concept of what happens with Russian communism, which is just as totalitarian as fascism. How is that going to be something that the democracies are going to impact? And then also this concept of whole societies mobilizing, which we'll talk about in the days to come, really starts to dominate. That we stop being something where we're at war. We're kind of constantly preparing for war. We constantly need to have our defenses up, and then morality is going to play a big role too. We're going to look back on what the Nazis did and what communism did, and to be honest, what some troops in on a smaller scale in democratic nations did, and try to figure out whether or not that was moral and how do we fight a war that is moral. All right, I want you to take 2 seconds to send your notebook. And I wanted a quick write. You guys have done good work getting through this. Just I want you to write just what your impact of today was there. You can focus on one thing that you thought was interesting, one thing that you learned, maybe a bigger, larger overall lesson about World War II. You could even, if you thought this was all stupid, tell me why you think this is stupid. I just want to hear what you thought about kind of hearing that broad strokes of World War II. Is it as interesting as